Welcome to the Meacham interviews. Today we have Bruce Bond. He's come all the way from Denton, Texas. How are you doing, Bruce?
Okay.
All right. We thought maybe you could begin by reading a poem.
Okay, I will. Maybe I'll give a little background so
Sure.
people get cleaner access to some of the things going on here. This is a poem called Invisible Hand. It's about Paul Wittgenstein, who was the brother of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher. Paul was a great concert pianist who was captured in the war and lost one of his hands. He's partly well known because after the war he survived, was released from prison, and commissioned many concertos for the left hand in particular. And so one is by Ravel, and that's referenced here. Also, Ludwig Wittgenstein is referenced here. He's most famous for certain statements about the limits of language, but also he wrote an early book called Tractatus, where he talks about how what we can't talk about we must pass over in silence. That's a famous quote from him, so that's in here. So I think that's all you need to know for this. It begins with an epigraph from Ludwig Wittgenstein that goes, "Our life has no end, the way our visual field has no limits." The name of the poem is The Invisible Hand. Light, we know, is an invisible thing. The beam that falls through the theaters of a childhood, we trust it's there, thanks only to the dust that floats inside it. And the screen, of course, the stuff that takes the dark of light and makes of it a story. In this way, light provides a language for the dawn of things, ourselves, for instance, how we travel through the first 2 years into the luminous amnesia of who we are, blind to the gods of days that made us. A body might be replaced 12, 13 times over, every cell hung on the architecture of what goes missing, the way the widow hangs on her son's arm, on the strength inside his long black sleeve. Today I listened to Ravel's concerto for the left hand, with its vague beginnings in the bass violins, the rocking cradle of the bow, as if it were tuning up for what's to come, for the slow emergence of a subject, the polish of the brass, the great wave that peaks and washes ashore the hand, the A, the lowest of the keys. It's the announcements of our soloist whose body lies buried in the ghost of sound. Do you think of him as well? Paul Wittgenstein, the man who lost his arm to a Russian bullet, how he woke in a prison hospital to find it gone. He could not see this yet as the birth of all the left-hand scores he would commission, Ravel's for one. In truth, music's origins are the casualties of every age. Given time, days wept a pool of light over charcoal keys he sketched on a crate. And as he taught his hand to play the parts that were not there, the reach of it grew desperate quick, as if it were two hands, worlds apart, one dead, another living, each one abandoned by the other, bound by that to the talk between them. What is more tangible, intangible, than the past to come? Remember him on stage, the tuck of the sleeve that fluttered in its pins. I have seen his performance in a movie, his hand leaping like a bird on fire, as if he lost what he lost, brought on an excess of life. The madness and the suicides of a tragic family, they can break you down or open or a little of both. You can almost hear him as he turns to his brother to say, is it true? What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. But what if silence too begins to speak or sing, to be the hand that is no longer there? What if death is dark as any beam that illuminates a score of music? Birth too, or the want to give birth and so be born. There is no idea as powerful as the will to have one. And as the orchestra gathers up its strength beneath the hand, everything falls the way a building falls through blooms of dust. I live for times like that, for beginnings, ends, the great dark hall alive and listening, the light we only know as light, the moment that it's broken.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. It really radiates out in a lot of ways. A couple of things. One, I've been interested myself in the whole notion of silence and what you can't speak.
Right.
And yet is somehow pre-words,
Sure.
something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Have you read a lot of philosophy?
Yeah, well, sure. I still read a lot. There was a time when philosophy was not necessarily always a good influence on my poetry. I was a little too heavy-handed and discursive, and I went to poetry as a way of balancing my reading diet in a way, because I think of poetry and philosophy as sort of as consciousness of one another. I mean, what poetry brings to the equation is not so much just talking about feelings or consciousness, but actually creating feelings and consciousness and embodying that sense of subjects and objects, or perceivers and perceived, as being conflated, as being one thing. It actually doesn't forge that, it restores that sense that we have, as children, that we are out there. So, and this is a big theme in the philosophy of this age, of Wittgenstein's age, and also the phenomenologists who were writing at the time. So, yeah, I find a lot of ideas there. I think of poetry as, all the poetry that I'm interested in, it has a love of idea that seems to be the strength of the medium. It's language, after all. It's made of ideas.
Yeah, when I read philosophy, I'm in many ways reading it for the metaphors that you find that are really, like a lot of science writing too. It's pretty incredible, and kind of rich source, gets you thinking of the world in a different way, really. In
a different way, absolutely. So what poetry brings to the equation is the sense of it as bearing upon certain emotional necessities, in a daily way. And here's a guy with a very real problem. I didn't have an extreme problem like this, but I could relate to it because I had a music career that got curtailed because of physical problems.
Oh, well, you came to poetry through music.
I did, yeah. So actually, this is kind of related. Poetry was for me a way of writing about myself and not myself. So that, once again, that's another way of me conceiving, this sense of perceivers and perceived as being one thing. I could explore and in fact create aspects of self by writing about other people. And it felt transformative in a kind of way that was healthy. I mean, it kind of restored my sense of purpose, and I had a new calling suddenly, because that was difficult for me in my 20s, making the transition into poetry, and it was a great blessing.
How did you actually develop as a writer?
When
did you first start writing, I guess?
I started writing probably when I was around 5, just dinking around, and I actually wrote a poem. I didn't like getting shots at the doctor's office, so I wrote a poem about my doctor and it got in the newspaper. And I wrote these very, very surreal stories. So I enjoyed that. I enjoyed being alone, when I was a kid, and creating imaginary worlds. So that's really where it started. And then in college, creative writing didn't really exist as a profession back then. It was in its infancy and it wasn't done terribly well. But I discovered Yeats. There were a number of lyricists I like, and I loved music. I got into it basically through music, but Yeats was the first guy on the page who just spoke to me, and partly because he was so musical. And he just cast a spell that was related to his musicality.
And it's incredibly musical, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's great to read out loud.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Auden and Stevens, I think those were big ones for me.
Do you find that your teaching affects your writing?
Sure,
Writing
yeah,
it for
because
your
I rip
teaching,
off
yeah.
my students all the time. All the time. Or I find myself saying something I've never said, and I go, oh, well, that would be cool. I'll use that somewhere.
I've used lines from students. I usually acknowledge
Yeah.
them, though. In the
Yeah. Oh, I never do. I steal shamelessly. I remember my friend Pete Fairchild was telling me a story. And oh, that's cool. I want to write about that. He said, well, you can, I'll let you write about it. I said, Pete, I don't have to ask your permission. I'm sorry. I'm going to do it anyway. So I do that with my students, and I encourage them to do it with me.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being here today.
Sure.
And,
Sure.
Have a good trip back and all that.
Okay.
Fun in your workshop tomorrow.
Okay, thanks.
All right.